The snow fell like judgment on her blood-soaked coat. Elsie Redcarver pressed her palm against the bullet wound, watching crimson seep between her fingers like spilled wine on white linen. Her gang had left her, not out of cruelty, but out of the cold mathematics of survival that governed their world. She understood. She would have done the same. The pine trees stood as silent witnesses to her dying, their branches heavy with snow that caught the last light of a winter afternoon. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the soft crunch of snowshoes approaching, and her heart hammered against her ribs with a terror deeper than death itself. Subscribe to witness a story of mercy that defies every law of the frontier. The Shoshone hunting party found her slumped against a lodgepole pine, her red hair stark as blood against the white bark. Chief Mato approached slowly, his weathered hands empty of weapons, his dark eyes reading the story written in her wounds and the scattered hoofprints around her. She tried to speak, to warn him away, but only a whisper escaped her cracked lips. The other hunters hung back, their faces carved from stone, waiting for their chief's judgment. Mato knelt beside her, close enough that she could smell the sage smoke in his buckskin shirt, close enough to see the lines that grief and wisdom had etched around his eyes. When she finally found her voice, the words came out broken and desperate. "Don't waste your mercy on me," she gasped, each word a struggle against the fire in her chest. "I'm nothing but trouble and blood. Leave me here to die with the snow." Her fingers clutched at the frozen ground, as if she could anchor herself to this moment of honesty, this final truth about what she believed herself to be. The wind moved through the pines above them, a sound like whispered prayers or distant mourning, and she closed her eyes against the kindness she saw in his face. She had spent her 22 years learning that mercy was a luxury the world couldn't afford, especially not for girls who chose the outlaw trail. The bullet wound throbbed with each heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to echo her unworthiness, her certainty that she deserved this ending in the snow. But Mato's hands were already moving, gentle and sure, checking her wounds with the practiced touch of someone who had seen too much death to waste time on judgment. "The snow will cover many things," he said quietly, his English careful and deliberate, "but it cannot cover what lives beneath. E.T." His words fell into the silence between them like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples she couldn't understand. She wanted to argue, to push him away, to make him see that saving her would only bring darkness to his people. Instead, she felt herself growing lighter, as if the blood loss was taking more than just her strength. It was taking her ability to hate herself with the fierce dedication that had kept her alive this long. The other hunters murmured among themselves in their own language, their voices carrying notes of concern and disapproval that needed no translation. When Mato lifted her into his arms, she felt the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek, heard the steady rhythm of his heart beneath the buckskin. The world tilted and swayed as he carried her, but his grip never faltered, never suggested that her weight was a burden he regretted taking on. Through half-closed eyes, she watched the snow-laden branches pass overhead like a canopy of stars, each flake that touched her face feeling like a small benediction she didn't deserve. The pain in her chest was nothing compared to the ache in her throat, the terrible pressure of tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. She had forgotten what it felt like to be held without conditions, to be carried towards safety instead of running from it, and the unfamiliarity of it made her want to fight against his kindness, even as her body surrendered to it. The hunting party moved through the forest like shadows, their snowshoes whispering against the drifts, their presence both protective and wary. She could feel the tension in their silence, the weight of questions they were too respectful to ask their chief directly. What was he thinking, bringing this wounded white woman back to their winter camp? What stories would her scars tell? What violence would follow in her wake? These were practical concerns, born from generations of hard-learned lessons about the cost of trust. But Mato's arms never loosened around her. His pace never quickened with doubt, and she found herself clinging to that steadiness, like a drowning woman clutches driftwood. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would grow from this moment of unexpected mercy. As consciousness began to slip away from her like water through cupped hands, Elsie felt something she hadn't experienced since childhood, the possibility that she might be worth saving after all. It was a dangerous thought, one that threatened to undo years of careful armor built from cynicism and self-loathing. But here in Mahto's arms, with the snow falling like forgiveness around them, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be seen as more than the sum of her mistakes. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was the sound of his voice, low and steady, speaking words in Shoshone that sounded like a prayer for the wounded, a blessing for the lost, a promise that mercy was not something that had to be earned. The Shoshone winter camp materialized from the forest like something conjured from smoke and starlight, its lodges arranged in a careful circle that spoke of generations of wisdom about survival and community. Mahto carried Elsie through the camp as evening painted the snow purple and gold, past faces that emerged from doorways to watch this strange procession with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. The women's eyes were particularly sharp, reading the story of violence written in Elsie's torn clothing and blood-stained hands, calculating the danger this wounded stranger might bring to their children. Mahto's own lodge stood at the eastern edge of the circle, larger than the others, its buffalo hide walls painted with symbols that seemed to dance in the firelight that leaked through the entrance flap. Inside, the air was warm and thick with the scent of sage and sweetgrass, a sanctuary that felt impossibly far from the cold world of bullets and betrayal she had known. Mahto laid her on a bed of soft furs near the central fire, his movements careful and reverent, as if he were handling something precious rather than a half-dead outlaw girl who had brought nothing but trouble into his peaceful world. An elderly woman appeared at his side, his aunt, Elsie would later learn, a medicine woman whose hands held the accumulated wisdom of decades spent healing both bodies and spirits. The old woman's eyes were like black stones polished smooth by time, and when she looked at Elsie, it felt as though she was seeing not just the wounds on the surface, but the deeper injuries that had driven a young woman to choose the outlaw trail. Without words, she began to work, her fingers probing the bullet wound with a gentleness that made Elsie want to weep for all the harsh touches she had endured in her short, violent life. The medicine woman's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with water heated over the fire, applying poultices made from plants Elsie couldn't name, but whose earthy scent seemed to draw the pain from her body like a magnet draws iron. Mahto knelt beside them, his presence a steady anchor in the swirling confusion of fever and gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her. When the old woman spoke, her voice was like wind through dry grass, carrying words in Shoshone that Mahto translated with careful precision. She says the bullet passed through cleanly, missing the vital places. She says your body wants to live, even if your spirit has forgotten how. The words hit Elsie like a physical blow, their accuracy cutting deeper than any blade, exposing truths she had spent years trying to bury beneath anger and recklessness. Outside the lodge, she could hear the murmur of voices, the camp settling into its evening rhythms, while grappling with the disruption her presence had brought. Children's laughter mixed with the low tones of adults discussing this unexpected development, their words carrying the weight of legitimate concerns about harboring a wounded outlaw. Mahto seemed to sense her awareness of the tension, his hand finding hers in the firelight, his calloused palm warm against her cold fingers. "They are afraid," he said simply, his honesty cutting through any pretense or false comfort. "They have seen what happens when white outlaws bring their troubles to our people. They remember the soldiers who came looking for men like those who rode with you." His words should have filled her with shame, but instead they carried an odd comfort, the relief of being spoken to as an adult capable of understanding the consequences of her choices. The medicine woman finished her work and spoke again, her eyes moving between Marteau and Elsie with an expression that seemed to weigh possibilities against probabilities. Marteau listened intently, then nodded slowly, his face grave with the responsibility of leadership. She says you will live, but healing takes time. She asks if you understand what it means to accept our help, that you will be bound to us by debt and honor until you are strong enough to choose your own path again. The weight of that obligation settled over Elsie like a heavy blanket, both comforting and terrifying in its implications. She had spent so long running from any connection that might slow her down or make her vulnerable, and now she found herself tethered to these people by bonds stronger than rope or iron, the unbreakable chains of gratitude and unexpected kindness. As the fire burned lower and the camp grew quiet around them, Elsie felt herself suspended between two worlds, the harsh landscape of her past, where mercy was weakness and trust was suicide, and this warm lodge where strangers had risked their own safety to pull her back from the edge of death. The medicine woman gathered her supplies and spoke one final time to Marteau, her words carrying the weight of prophecy or warning. When she was gone, Marteau settled beside the fire, his presence a silent promise that she would not face the long night alone. "What did she say?" Elsie whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. Marteau was quiet for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the dancing light as he chose his words carefully. "She said that sometimes the spirits send us broken things not to test our charity, but to teach us that healing is possible for everyone, even those who have forgotten how to hope." The fever broke on the fourth day, leaving Elsie weak as a newborn colt, but clear-minded enough to understand the magnitude of her situation. She lay on soft buffalo hides in a lodge that smelled of sage and wood smoke, watching shadows dance across painted walls that told stories she couldn't read. Her shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, but the pain felt clean now, honest, not like the festering guilt that had poisoned her thoughts for months. Through the lodge opening, she could see women moving between fires, their voices carrying the rhythm of a life she had never known, one built on seasons and ceremonies rather than desperation and greed. When Marteau entered carrying a bowl of broth, she turned her face away, unable to meet his steady gaze. The kindness in his dark eyes felt like looking directly into the sun. Too bright, too pure for someone like her. "I should be dead," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Why didn't you let me die out there?" The question hung between them like smoke, heavy with all the reasons she believed herself unworthy of salvation. She had killed, stolen, lied. Her hands were stained with choices that couldn't be washed clean, no matter how gently these people tended her wounds. Marteau set the bowl beside her and settled cross-legged on the ground, his presence both commanding and peaceful. "Death comes for all of us when it's time," he said simply, his English careful but clear. "But the spirits whispered that your time had not come, that you had something left to give this world." His words struck her like a physical blow because she knew with bitter certainty that she had nothing left to offer anyone. She was empty, hollowed out by years of running and fighting and choosing the wrong path at every crossroads. The very idea that she might have value, might be worth saving, felt like a cruel joke played by a universe that had already taken everything good from her life. "You don't understand," she said, struggling to sit up despite the fire that shot through her shoulder. "I'm not some lost lamb who wandered off the path. I chose this life. I chose to ride with killers and thieves. I chose to point a gun at innocent people and take what wasn't mine." The words poured out of her like poison from a lanced wound, each confession making her feel smaller and more worthless. She wanted him to see her clearly, to understand that his mercy was wasted on someone who had forfeited the right to redemption long ago. The weight of her choices pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Hard to believe that anyone could look at her and see something worth preserving. But Mato's expression didn't change, didn't harden with judgment or soften with pity. He simply listened, his dark eyes holding her gaze with a steadiness that made her feel exposed and strangely safe at the same time. "I have seen many people make choices they regret," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Some because they were hungry, some because they were afraid, some because they had forgotten who they were meant to be. But I have also seen that the heart can change, that the spirit can heal if given the chance." His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and unfamiliar, offering a possibility she had never dared to consider. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the lodge poles and sending sparks spiraling up through the smoke hole like tiny prayers ascending to a sky that might, impossibly, still have room for her among its stars. The camp stirred with unrest as word spread that the white woman was recovering. Elsie could hear the heated discussions outside her lodge, voices rising and falling like the wind through the pines, carrying fragments of anger and fear that needed no translation. She understood enough to know that her presence had divided Mato's people, that some saw her as a threat to be eliminated, while others viewed her as a test of their chief's wisdom. The knowledge sat heavy in her chest, another burden to add to the collection of guilt she carried, like stones in her pockets, weighing her down with each step toward an uncertain future. 3 women entered her lodge that morning, their faces painted with suspicion and barely contained hostility. The eldest, her grey hair braided with silver ornaments that caught the firelight, spoke in rapid Shoshone while gesturing toward Elsie with obvious disdain. Though she couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear as mountain water. They wanted her gone, wanted her poison removed from their sacred space before it could spread and contaminate everything they held dear. Elsie pulled the buffalo robe closer around her shoulders, feeling smaller and more vulnerable than she had since childhood, when her father's drunken rages had sent her hiding in the root cellar. When Mato arrived, the tension in the lodge thickened like smoke from green wood. The eldest woman, whom Elsie had learned was called Ayana, stepped forward and spoke with the authority of someone who had earned the right to challenge even a chief. Her words came fast and sharp, punctuated by gestures that left no doubt about her position. The white woman was a danger, a wolf in sheep's clothing who would bring destruction to their people just as her kind always had. Elsie watched Mato's face as he listened, saw the weight of leadership settle across his features like a heavy cloak, the burden of making decisions that would affect every soul in his care. "She speaks from love," Mato said quietly to Elsie after the women had left, their departure marked by meaningful looks and whispered conversations that would spread through the camp like wildfire. "Ayana has seen what happens when we trust too easily, when we open our hearts to those who would use our kindness against us. Her husband died defending our people from soldiers who came under a flag of peace." His words painted a picture that made Elsie's stomach clench with understanding. She was not just a wounded stranger seeking shelter, but a representative of a people who had brought nothing but pain and betrayal to this place. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on her like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe, hard to justify her continued presence among people who had every reason to hate her. She thought of the robberies, the stagecoaches stopped and passengers terrorized, the way she had looked into frightened faces and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of taking what she wanted. How many of those people had families like this one? Children who would grow up fearing strangers, women who would teach their daughters to hide when riders approached. The realization that she had been part of that cycle of violence and fear made her want to crawl out of her own skin, to somehow shed the person she had been and emerge clean and new. But as she lay there in the flickering firelight, listening to the sounds of a community going about its evening rituals, she began to understand that redemption wasn't something that could be granted by others. It was something that had to be earned, one choice at a time, one act of courage or kindness or simple human decency that proved the heart could indeed change, that the spirit could heal if given the chance to try. Snow began falling on the 7th day of Elsie's recovery, fat flakes that drifted down like pieces of torn sky, blanketing the camp in a silence so profound it seemed to muffle even thoughts. She stood at the entrance of her lodge, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, watching children play in the gathering drifts while their mothers worked nearby, their movements efficient and purposeful in the way of people who understood that winter demanded respect. The scene before her felt like something from a dream, so far removed from the harsh realities of her former life that she wondered if the fever had damaged more than just her body, if perhaps she had died out there in the snow, and this was some strange afterlife reserved for the undeserving. Marteau found her there as the afternoon light began to fade, his approach silent as falling snow. "You are strong enough to travel now," he said, his words carrying no judgment, only the simple statement of fact that she had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. "My scouts report that the passes will be clear for another few days before the heavy snows come. If you wish to leave, to return to your old life, now would be the time." The choice he offered hung between them like a bridge spanning a chasm, one path leading back to everything she had known, the other into territory so foreign she couldn't even imagine what lay beyond the first step. She thought of her gang, probably holed up in some cave or abandoned cabin, counting the money from their last job and planning the next one. They would have written her off by now, divided her share among themselves, and forgotten her name before the blood had dried on the snow where they left her. The realization should have hurt, should have filled her with anger or betrayal, but instead, she felt only a strange emptiness, as if that part of her life had been a story told about someone else. A tale of violence and desperation that no longer seemed to fit the person standing in this peaceful camp. "And if I stay?" she asked, though the question felt presumptuous, like asking for something she had no right to want. The very idea seemed impossible, a white outlaw woman finding sanctuary among the Shoshone, learning their ways, earning their trust. She could imagine the looks, the whispered conversations, the constant weight of proving herself worthy of the chance she had been given. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, something else stirred, a hunger she hadn't felt in years, a desperate longing for belonging, for purpose, for the possibility of becoming someone better than the person she had been. Marteau was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains where the last light of day painted the peaks in shades of gold and rose. "If you stay," he said finally, "you would have to leave your old self behind completely. No more running, no more taking what doesn't belong to you, no more choosing the easy path when the right one demands sacrifice. You would have to learn our ways, accept our laws, prove to my people that you are worthy of the trust they would be asked to give." His words were not a threat, but a promise, a roadmap to redemption that would require her to walk through fire to reach the other side. As darkness settled over the camp and the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Elsie felt something shift inside her chest, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. For the first time in years, she could see a future that didn't end in violence or despair. A path that led not toward destruction, but toward something she had never dared to hope for, the chance to matter, to belong, to wake up each morning knowing that her presence in the world made it a little bit better rather than a little bit worse. The snow continued to fall, covering her tracks from the past and offering her a blank page on which to write a different story.